Thank you. Welcome, everybody, to our week 7 of the California Countercultures course. I'm privileged to introduce my co-conspirator, co-curator, co-professor, co-organizer of the course, Mark Cohen today. And first, I have to just always say a few words about this course. As we all now know, and those of you who are following it, this project is part undergraduate class at UC Berkeley and part public lecture series and a part arts access program. And it's made possible by generous support from the Mellon Foundation, Cal Performances, Lisa and Douglas Goldman, whose support for the General Big Ideas program is also under the umbrella of Arts and Design, the Arts and Design Initiative. So together with all of these different cohorts, and Michael and myself, this class has been created. So I wanted to say a few things first. Michael gave me his own biography, which I'll read in a moment to introduce him. But I wanted to say that it's been a great privilege working and creating this course with Michael, because not only does he keep me on my toes, but he challenges me in hilarity and an extended capacity for convolution, which those of you who have just finished the crying lot of Lot 49 will appreciate, and also in a state of intellectual paranoia. No, just joking. With that said, I'll read you Michael's bio, written by him. So today's speaker is the child of 2 public school teachers from Denver. Michael attended the University of Colorado at Boulder before earning his PhD in American Studies from Yale University. And today, Professor Cohen is an associate teaching professor in American Studies and African American Studies here. And he'll gladly sign any of you up to be a major after today's lecture is completed. So please see Professor Cohen for that. His writings have appeared nowhere of great importance, and including the American Quarterly, Radical History Review, Southern Cultures, Algerisa's English, and Gawker.com, among other famously defunct outlets. He also would like you all to know that he is not Thomas Pynchon. But before he comes to the stage today to speak, and the title of today's talk is Thomas Pynchon's Paranoid California, I just wanted to read, in Monday's class, Professor Cohen introduced the context for the crying, well, basically for today's talk, and the crying lot of Lot 49, which the students have read. And he challenged the students just to read through it, however difficult, bizarre, impossible the writing might be. And he also asked for us to focus in on particular chapters or sentences or paragraphs that we could really think about. And so I've read this book several times, and there's so many passages I would read, but today I wanted, in honor of Professor Cohen, page 198 of this version. It's a conversation between Oedipa and Genghis Cohen, and it ends with one of my favorite sentences in the book. So Genghis Cohen is speaking. A few months ago, it got quite cloudy. You see, in spring, when the dandelions begin to bloom again, the wine goes through a fermentation as if they remembered. No, thought Oedipa, sad, as if their home cemetery in some way still did exist in a land where you could somehow walk and not need the East San Narciso freeway, and bones still could rest in peace, nourishing ghosts of dandelions, no one to plow them up. as if the dead really do persist, even in a bottle of wine. So on that note, welcome. All right. Whoa. Your notes.
That's mine.
Wait, this is you. Okay.
Don't take my talk.
Sorry, I took your
No worries. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I promise you this will be weird. It's a psychological challenge to spend this much time reading this crazy work and then trying to take what's is bouncing off the interior of your brain and then try and put it out there in public. So if this doesn't make sense, raise your hand. I'll start over. Today's musical selections, because we do music in Berkeley time, let me just put on my Mucho Mas DJ voice. We heard Vitamin C by Can, Torden Frade by the Rolling Stones, and Hocus Pocus by Focus, everyone's favorite Dutch prog rock band. Now, today's talk is going to essentially proceed in a series of parts in which we'll have a kind of literary opening. We'll make a bend into history via the form of the conspiracy theory. We'll have a brief interlude into political philosophy and end right back here in dear old Berkeley. Now, this is a peculiar phenomenon in part because, and the danger here is that I've read way too much Pynchon. I have no idea how much any of you have read. And as I said, one of you out there, probably not y'all, but one of you maybe in the upper deck might actually be Thomas Pynchon. It is possible. We don't really know where he is. We assume he's in New York. We don't really know what he looks like. But if you are Thomas Pynchon or if you have met him, please let me know. I would love to hear that story. But what my attention here to is to argue effectively that Thomas Pynchon is a countercultural novelist, perhaps the quintessential countercultural novelist, the writer of California in the 1960s, in particular starting with The Crying of Lot 49 and proceeding apace to a series of other major California novels, in particular Gravity's Rainbow, which of course does not take place in California until the essential last page. And then Vineland, which is really the novel about how the 60s ended in California. He'll eventually go on to write another text about a novel about California, but I want to sort of stick to this sort of 60s trilogy, if you will, which is Crying of Lot 49, Gravity's Rainbow, and Vineland. And argue, right, of his place as a kind of the quintessential or the definitive countercultural novelist in American letters. And thereby sort of make a particular claim, which is to say that Pynchon is probably the most relevant figure that we have available to us, the most widely read or encountered figure in anything that might be considered something like hippie modernism or what I think of as countercultural postmodernism. Just to begin, I want to, these some of the many lives of Thomas Pynchon's work. I should have, shown you this. There's him on The Simpsons, him on Mad Men, the absolutely stunningly groovy cover of the first paperback edition. I'm a big fan of judging books by their cover. And here's the collected body of work. We'll look at these in a moment. The other California novel is Inherent Vice, which came out in 2009 and was actually made into a movie by Paul Thomas Anderson, in which So let's begin actually with the text itself. Now, because this is a literary talk, there's going to be a lot of reading involved. Now, I'm going to put the texts up on the screen here, and then I'll read alongside, and then we'll work our way back through this. So we begin essentially with what amounts to an exercise in close reading. So if you'll please follow along. All right. So here it is. This is the opening paragraph. You'll notice that Pynchon's paragraphs are painfully long, as are his sentences, but there's a point to that. All right, one summer afternoon, Miss Oedipa Moss came home from a Tupperware party, whose hostess had put perhaps too much kirsch in the fondue to find that she, Oedipa, had been named executor, or she supposed executrix, of the estate of one Pierce Inverarity, a California real estate mogul who had once lost $2 million in his spare time, but still had assets numerous and tangled enough to make the job of sorting it all out more than honorary. Oedipus stood in the living room, stared at by the greenish dead eye of the TV tube, spoke the name of God, tried to feel as drunk as possible, but this did not work. She thought of a hotel room in Mazatlan whose door had been slammed, it seemed forever, waking up 200 birds down in the lobby, a sunrise over the library slope at Cornell University that nobody on it had seen because the slope faces west, a dry, disconsolate tune from the fourth movement of the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra, a whitewashed bust of Jay Gould, that Pierce, kept over the bed on a shelf so narrow that she'd always had the hovering fear it would someday topple on them. Was that how he died, she wondered, among dreams, crushed by the only icon in the house? That only made her laugh, out loud and helpless. You're so sick, Oedipa, she told herself, or the room, which knew. Now, so begins, right, Thomas Pynchon's most widely read novel, the one that I have assigned to more than half of the room, namely The Crying of Lot 49, originally published in 1965 as the young, already quite successful, if camera-shy and flight-prone writer's second novel. From what we know about Pynchon, he disliked this book very much. He told his friends over the years that he wrote it for money. He called it a quickie potboiler, written to get out of his contract with his then publisher. In his only explicit autobiographical writing to date, Pynchon lamented how this story was, in his words, quote, marketed as a novel, and in which I seem to have forgotten most of what I thought I'd learned up till then. Despite this autobiographical shade, The Crying of Lot 49 is the best possible introduction to the work of America's second greatest living author. I give the top billing to Toni Morrison for having won a Nobel Prize. I think Bob Dylan has Thomas Pynchon's Nobel Prize, maybe as it should be, but because neither one of them was going to show up to accept the award. Now, because of its brevity, it is important not just because not just everyone is going to love Pynchon and the way he writes and the way what his fiction is doing, right? It's good to start short because most of you are going to end up hating it. And that's fine. For some, it is too silly. For some, it is too dark. And for those poor fools like myself who recognize both in the text and in the world, Crying of Lot 49 is apt to serve as a gateway drug into Pynchon's larger rewritings of American history. At his best, and indeed his most confusing, all of his best and most confusing attributes are on display in this text, even in this opening passage. The detailed and obscure historical references to Jay Gould, to Bartok, to Cornell University, to California real estate moguls and the like. We get his intense fascination with wordplay, executor, executrix. Silly character names pierce in veracity and they proliferate throughout. The slapstick and satire which chase the mood from page to page. We find the evocation of a detective story in which our ordinary hero sets off along a labyrinthine plot in search of a conspiracy far too totalizing and powerful to ever be revealed to someone as passed over and as preterite as the rest of us. We see Pynchon's vision of our fragmented memories and consciousness as a play of surfaces, and that list of references in her sort of dream of seeing things that can't exist, music and smells wafting through her mind, right? But also we see his ability to precisely capture a historical or emotional moment and then to mock it in the seemingly same instant. We also find an immense intensity of emotion that is often lacking in the work of his postmodernist peers. Through the feelings generated, right, in his works that we kind of can recognize, right, as California's enduring dialectic of sunshine and noir, of the psychic sandpaper of 1960s rebellion scraping up against the emerging political paranoia, the anguished and exuberant struggle between the personal and the statistical, between human freedom and various systems of domination. We can see this struggle in the opening sentences, which are an achievement of style and form. The flowing soap bubble in a hurricane-like movement of the line manages to evoke both the boredom of suburban plenitude and the terror of constant surveillance. Oedipa stood in the living room, stared at by the greenish dead eye of the TV tube, spoke the name of God, tried to feel as drunk as possible, but this did not work. Well, whose failure is this? Oedipa's? Did God fail? Is Oedipa projecting her inner psychological state onto the world, or is the world staring at and controlling her? Is this her first flash of paranoia, or is she suddenly witnessing a vast conspiracy now revealing itself to her? You're so sick, Oedipa, she told herself, or the room, which knew. What exactly does the room know? What kind of intelligence or control is in that room, and what are they doing to poor Oedipa? Right. Oedipa herself, with the boozy fondue and Tupperware party, is introduced to us as a San Mateo County housewife, complete with herb garden, fresh lasagna, and a psychologically broken husband, the former used car salesman turned Muzak DJ at KCUF Radio, and you'll work out the letters on that one. Wendell Mucho Moss. Now, Wendell is broken. Mucho is broken because he doesn't believe in his job. Somehow he needs to believe in his job as a used car salesman or as a crappy DJ playing kazoo music. His failure to believe leads to his ruination. Now I will say, like this ad here on the side, why is this woman so high? This is an ad for Benzedrine. Okay. She's also under the now her husband is falling apart, but luckily for Oedipus, she's also under the watchful care of Dr. Hilarius, a former Nazi turned government psychiatrist who wants to recruit her to, quote, an experiment he was helping the community hospital run on the effects of LSD-25, mescaline, psilocybin, and related drugs on a large sample of suburban housewives. Yet, despite all of this, our Oedipa turns away from Mucho. She refuses Hilarius's pills, though those two patriarchal characters will eventually find each other in the last chapter. And she shows us that her adventurous and independent spirit have not been entirely extinguished from her suburban containment. I will actually argue that, in a sense, The Crying of Lot 49 is more of a feminist book than we might originally be inclined to read it as. So, another passage. As things develop, and this passage will be broken up, I'll give you images, so this is all one continuous passage here. As things developed, she was to have all manner of revelations, hardly about Pierce and Verarity or herself, but about what remained, yet had somehow, before this, stayed away. There had hung this sense of buffering, insulation. She had noticed the absence of intensity, as if watching a movie, just perceptibly out of focus, that the projectionist refused to fix. In Mexico City, they somehow wandered into an exhibition of paintings by the beautiful Spanish exile Remedios Varos. In the central painting of a triptych entitled Bordando el Manto Terrestre, where a number of frail girls with heart-shaped faces, huge eyes, spun gold hair, prisoners in the top room of a circular tower, embroidering a kind of tapestry which spilled out the slit window and into a void, seeking hopelessly to fill the void. For all the other buildings and creatures, all the waves, ships, and forests of the earth were contained in this tapestry, and the tapestry was the world. And this tapestry was the world. Sorry, I lost my place. And this tapestry was the world. Oedipa, perverse, had stood in front of the painting and cried. Now, there are lots of crying going on in this book, not just in the last line. She had looked down at her feet and known then, because of a painting, that what she stood on had only been woven together a couple thousand miles away in her own tower, was only by accident known as Mexico, and so Pierce had taken her away from nothing. There'd been no escape. What did she so desire escape from? Such a captive maiden, having plenty of time to think, soon realizes that her tower, its height and architecture, are like her ego, only incidental. That what really keeps her where she is magic, anonymous and malignant, visited on her from outside and for no reason at all. Having no apparatus except gut fear and female cunning to examine this formless magic, to understand how it works, how to measure its field strength, count its lines of force, she may fall back on superstition or take up a useful hobby like embroidery, or go mad, or marry a disc jockey. If the tower is everywhere, and the night of deliverance no proof against its magic, what else? So on the one hand, this is a story of one woman's attempted self-emancipation from the feminine mystique, here imagined as the Rapunzel's tower of her own middle-class reality. What did she so desire escape from? This is at once, right here's what did she so desire escape from? This is at once a personal question posed by lonely Oedipa on the verge of her quest across California, and it is also a political question posed to an entire generation of affluent Americans standing at the thaw of the 1950s containment and on the brink of the great countercultural uprising. On the other hand, this metaphor of tower and tapestry becoming the world, born out of a singularly specific intertextual reference to Varro's painting, is also a challenge to the very nature of reality itself, especially realities depicted through literary and textual representations. Of what is our reality made? Of course, Pynchon never lets us escape the answer to this question, because the world, at least his world, is made out of words, just as the painting's world is made out of canvas. Pynchon's America is a text, a literary landscape, and a tale told about language itself. The tower, the tapestry, the journey to map it, even the metaphor itself is a text. There is no outside to the text. And yet there is an outside to the text. We all know it. We all live it, right? Because there is, of course, us, the reader, whether a baffled student, the nostalgic public, or an overconfident professor standing at a lectern. It is the one holding the book whose time, attention, and more or less careful reading practices transforms the inert lines of text into a living, breathing novel. And so The Crying of Lot 49 is essentially also about reading, about learning how to read texts, how to uncover signs, and to string the seemingly random moments of this hallucinatory California dream into what can only be understood as a plot in the dual sense of the word, plot, meaning a secret conspiracy and a narrative structure, both of which require the reader to become a detective of sorts. Turn to Walter Benjamin here, the great German Jewish Marxist thinker who died at his own hands fleeing the Nazis, who writes in his essay on the flaneur, "In times of terror, when everyone is something of a conspirator, everybody will be in a situation where he has to play detective." The name Oedipa Maas alone is worth, of course, 1,000 words, and more ink has been spilled on this character name than probably any other in literary history. Oedipa Maas, what a name redolent with meaning. Not the least of which for its hailing of Western literature's most doomed detective, namely Sophocles' Oedipus. Now, spoiler alert here, Oedipa never completes the job of sorting it all out, especially after she finds herself on this trail of the Trastero, an ancient and mysterious underground mail system seemingly at work connecting disparate subcultural underworlds. This is where we are revealed, right, the chalk post horn all over San Francisco and in the Bay Area. Since Raymond Chandler reinvented the private detective as Los Angeles flaneur in the 1930s and 40s, the work of American detective fiction has been less about tracking clues and arresting culprits as it is about the work of psychologically and cognitively mapping the city spaces. The detective is the only subjectivity capable of connecting all of the disparate places that make up a city as widespread, as diverse, and as segregated as Los Angeles. Classes and identities, right, proliferate in the sprawling Southern California empire, and the detective alone can trace them into a coherent city. If Philip Marlowe is the suit and fedora-wearing, world-weary knight taking on the corruption of petty gangsters and old money in a flat, high-modernist Los Angeles, then Oedipa Maas, like the entire post-war generation, confronts a corporate and institutional state of bewildering size, bloated by the Second World War into a totality that exceeds her grasp and before which she eventually comes to question her own sanity. What Oedipa reveals then, or what Pynchon maps through Oedipa, is a terrain of freedom and domination, which, on the one hand, we find the countercultural or the cultural cartography or alternative universes crowding into mid-century California, a state on the verge of revolt. Or, on the other hand, the novel becomes a theme park map of the military-industrial academic complex in paranoid California land. The adventure, of course, then begins with a drive south to the fictional city of San Narciso, or San Narcisco, obviously a pun, right? I didn't have to say that, duh, right. Another passage. San Narciso lay further south, near LA. Like many named places in California, it was less an identifiable city than a grouping of concepts. Census tracts, special purpose bond issue districts, shopping nuclei, all overlaid with access roads to its own freeway. But it had been Pierce's domicile and headquarters, the place that he'd begun his land speculating in 10 years ago, and so put down the plinth course of capital on which everything afterward had been built, however rickety or grotesque towards the sky. And that, she supposed, would set the spot apart, give it an aura. But if there was any vital difference between it and the rest of Southern California, it was invisible at first glance. She drove into San Narciso on a Sunday in a rented Impala. Nothing was happening. She looked down a slope, needing to squint for the sunlight, into a vast sprawl of houses which had grown up all together like a well-tended crop from the dull brown earth. And she thought of the time she'd opened a transistor radio to replace a battery and seen her first printed circuit. The ordered swirl of houses and streets from this high angle sprang at her now with the same unexpected, astonishing clarity as the circuit card had. Though she knew even less about radios than about Southern Californians, there was to both outward appearance and to both outward patterns a hieroglyphic sense of concealed meaning, of an intent to communicate. There seemed no limit to what the printed circuit could have told her if she had tried to find out. So in her first minute of San Narciso, a revelation also trembled just past the threshold of her understanding. This is, of course, a satire of Southern California architecture and city planning. Excuse me, and I will say throughout, I'm going to use photographs in part by Dennis Stock here from his 1970 photography collection called The California Trip, which, if you ask me, is his attempt to photograph the narrative of the Crying of Lot 49. Seems to just, I believe he may have just read the novel and was like, I'm going to take pictures and make this work. But Dennis Stock, for what it's worth, is a New York photojournalist who took that famous picture that some of you may have had on your dorm room wall in college of James Dean in Times Square. Right, he made so much money on this that he fled New York and came to California and got freaked the hell out. Could not believe what he was looking at. It scared the crap out of him. And he produced a series of crazy photographs, some of which we'll be looking at. So, as I said, this is, of course, satire. But it is, of course, a vision that is perhaps more familiar to us now than it might have been in even 1965. California, as on the one hand, a suburban expansion plowing under agricultural land without losing the visual resemblance of crops of houses in nice little rows, but also as a technoscape of a circuit board city shaped by new technologies capable of infinite communicative channels. This is perhaps the first literary vision of a future Silicon Valley, but this one is, of course, not based on computers and software. This one is built on the original foundation of all of Silicon Valley's much vaunted libertarian innovation, namely the military technologies, state expenditures, and huge defense contractors that undergirded all of the technology of the cybernetic revolution. This was San Narciso, and as she continues, then she arrives right at what is the kind of landmark that I want to attach myself to, which is this was San Narciso's big source of employment, the Galactronics division of Yoyodyne Incorporated, one of the giants of the aerospace industry. Oedipa gets her first glimpse of the muted post-horn symbol of the Trastero at an electronic music bar, the Scope, inhabited by strange Yoyodyne employees, only to find more symbols still at Fangoso Lagoons, Inverarity's last housing development, and through an obscure reference in Pynchon's parody of an 18th century pornographic revenge drama, The Courier's Tragedy, which takes up the majority of Chapter 3. Chasing the signs and signifiers, Oedipa pursues the Trastero along two narrative threads, each of which is essential to Pynchon's own biography. One follows through engineering and technology, the other through literature and historical research. In pursuit of her revelations, then, Oedipa arrives one morning at a Yoyodyne stockholders meeting where she is, like any woman in tech, persistently sexually harassed, before the company president, Mr. Clayton Bloody Chicklets, leads the shareholders and proxies in the Yoyodyne Songfest. Pynchon's songs are one of his singular pleasures, or one of the singular pleasures of his writing. Throughout every book, and often on only the flimsiest of pretexts, characters break out into original and usually absurd songs. Sometimes these songs are simple satire and comic relief. Sometimes they express a poignant emotion, and sometimes, as in this case, they project a world. This song, in particular, that I want to sing for you, is sung to the tune of Aura Lee, more or less the melody of Love Me Tender, and so kindly indulge me and follow the bouncing ball. Excuse me. All right. Bendix guides the warheads in, Avco builds them nice, Douglas North American, Grumman get their slice. Martin launches off a pad, Lockheed from a sub. We can't get the R&D on a Piper Cub. Convair boosts the satellites into orbits round. Boeing builds the Minuteman, we stay on the ground. Yo-Yo-Dine, contracts flee thee yet. DOD has shafted thee, out of spite I'll bet. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. All right. Now why did I do that? Other than I wanted to. Why did I torment you with a wretched version of a song in which shareholders and engineers of an aerospace company lament their failures, longing for the holy grail of military-industrial contracts, what Martin, Lockheed, Convair, and Boeing all hold in common, namely enormous military deals to build ICBMs and NASA launch vehicles. For those of you acronymically impaired, an ICBM is an intercontinental ballistic missile. On the one hand, NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, we may have forgotten what that is too. On the one hand, now, of course, these guys have a lot to be anxious about, what with the threat of computers and the sense of doom-laden responsibility for being that big white thumb that threatens to destroy the universe, right? The anxiety of the weapons engineer, right? With all this government spending come an all-white male technocratic workforce complete with a new array of ultra-modern white-collar anxieties. Take, for example, the deep worry on the face of this lead engineer of an IBM ad from January 1952. Slide rule in hand, he ponders the fate of his white-on-white tribe, which multiplies into a free-floating cubicles behind him. Together, these anxious employees of the military-industrial complex fear that their talents, like slide ruling or slide rulering, or whatever the now extinct verb was to use a slide rule, will someday be rendered obsolete, replaced by a big, expensive electronic brain. Perhaps some fraction of them also worry about the moral identification with that huge white thumb that presses the big red fire button that launches the missile, ready as a rifle bullet. That's the slogan. I mean, why do they need to advertise? I don't know. Why do people who manufacture nuclear weapons need to advertise their nuclear missiles? I never understand this, but here they are. There's tons of them. I'll show you more. Personal anxiety and universal annihilation have rarely stood so closely together as with the all-white male world of rocket scientists at this time. Now, of course, this song matters, not just because it's kind of fun, but because the companies all mentioned in the song, who seem to be doing better than poor Yo-Yo-Dine, are easily mapped onto the wartime and post-war political economy of California. Bendix Pacific Military Systems builds avionics for airplanes and missile components for ICBMs in their plant in Sylmar, California. Avco has no relationship to California. They have a few outlets, but again, why are they advertising? Hey, we build missiles, airplanes, bombers, and love us, I guess. I don't know. Avco, they build them nice. Douglas was founded in Santa Monica in 1921, built bombers during the war, and later developed the Nike missile defense systems, which installed missile batteries in the Marin Headlands and across Tilden Park. North American Aviation, a division of General Motors, built bombers, fighters, experimental jets, and eventually the space shuttle at their factory in Downey, California. And then their rocket booster subdivision, Rocketdyne, will be, of course, the pun for Yo-Yo-Dine. Northrop Grumman, one of the largest defense contractors in the world, manufactured the Apollo lunar lander, has one of its many corporate headquarters today in San Jose. The Martin, Vanguard, and Titan I rockets were launched largely from Vandenberg Air Force Base, being the United States military's first multi-stage intercontinental ballistic missile in service from 1959 to 1965. Lockheed moved to Burbank in 1928 and established their Missile and Space Division in Sunnyvale, California, as well as a covert research lab in Menlo Park, where they developed Corona, the world's first spy satellites launched out of Vandenberg Air Force Base. But also, they're perhaps most important for building the ultimate first strike nuclear weapon, namely the Polaris missile, which you see rendered beautifully by the art department of Lockheed. Here's the Piper Cub. Convair built bombers during World War II in San Diego and developed the Atlas missile, equally capable of launching the first American into space or destroying Moscow with a hydrogen bomb. Take your pick, same vehicle. And of course then, Boeing, the manufacturer of the Minuteman, designed to be launched in a minute, is important for this story because for a spell after college, Thomas Pynchon actually worked for Boeing. Yo-yo dine, yo-yo dine. Right, DOD has shafted thee. Out of spite, I'll bet. Now, one of the few definitive facts, so right, all of these major defense contractors and their technology is grounded in California somewhere, right? They're attached to the state. They map the state and the power dynamics of the state, in the state of California. Now, one of the few definitive facts that we have about the life of Thomas Ruggles Pynchon, born in Oyster Bay, Long Island in 1937, is that between February 2nd, 1960 and September 13th, 1962, as he was completing his first novel, V, published in 1963, Pynchon lived in Seattle, Washington, where he worked for the Boeing Corporation as a writer and engineering aide for one of Boeing's in-house magazines, the Beaumark News Service News. Now, the Beaumark, what you're looking at here, was a massive ramjet-propelled surface-to-air missile that could be equipped with conventional or nuclear warheads and tasked with the mission of shooting down incoming Soviet bombers. Between 1947 and 1964, Boeing produced some 700 of these missiles, and during his 2.5 years at the company, Pynchon aided engineers in drafting technical manuals and wrote stories about missile safety. This is the Beaumark News, and now, I mean, none of these articles have bylines, and scholars today do struggle to try and figure out which of these Pynchon actually wrote. But I'm going to take a wild guess and assume that the article called "Blame It on Osmosis" and "Astronauts and Acid" was most definitely written by Thomas Pynchon. By every account, Pynchon hated working for Boeing, lending his combined talents as an engineer and author to a company determined to build the premier weapon for nuclear Armageddon, namely the Minuteman. And this experience provided the technical and ethical background for what will become his singular masterpiece, namely Gravity's Rainbow in 1973. Sorry, I have a few extraneous slides here. Pynchon's unique ability to build scientific terms and mathematical metaphors into his literary fiction is an essential element of his unique postmodern style, and it would seem to be the end product of his unique background and education. Though he grew up in a blandly suburban Long Island in the 1940s, Pynchon is descendant of one of the oldest families in the United States, with a great-great-uncle, the president of Trinity College, who was satirized by no less than Nathaniel Hawthorne in The House on the Seven Gables. By the time Thomas was born, the family had long since settled into middle-class Republican respectability. An all-consuming reader, young Tom skipped 2 grades before entering high school, where, as a 16-year-old, several photos appeared in his yearbook, providing the bulk of the tiny handful of authenticated photographs of the man and what he described as his Bugs Bunny chompers. So these are literally 4 of the 7 extant photographs of Thomas Pynchon. 3 of these, the first 2 and the last one, were actually high school yearbook photos, and then the picture from 1957 when he joined the Navy. The other photos are just as from the same time period. Like this is a man who has not been photographed in his adult life, publicly photographed in his adult life. Upon entering Cornell University in the mid-1950s, Thomas majored in engineering physics, famously the most difficult program at Cornell, a program dedicated to feed the Eisenhower-era military growth with the mathematical and scientific geniuses needed to win the Cold War. But after 2 years, Pynchon dropped out of college and enlisted in the Navy, where he saw the world, learned a few languages, learned the ways of entropy and debauchery that would animate much of his early writing, and gave him his ear for distinctly American voices. Upon returning to Cornell, Pynchon abandoned engineering and turned to the study of English, where he probably took a class from Vladimir Nabokov, who did not remember him, and befriended future SDS President Kirkpatrick Sale and the writer and folk singer Richard Farina. Pynchon published his first short stories and wrote a detailed treatment of an opera with Kirkpatrick Sale called Minstrel Island, about a colony of artists who escape a tyrannical America governed by an IBM computer. This was an attempt to write an opera. After graduation, Pynchon published a few beat and surrealist short stories, met his literary agent, and sold the rights to his first novel. Now, while working for Boeing, Pynchon finished V, and immediately used the $1,000 paycheck to skip town, fleeing to Mexico and swearing to never work for a corporation or live in the middle-class world ever again. Much later, he writes in the introduction to Slow Learner from 1984, I got around to two mighty influences, Edmund Wilson's To the Finland Station and Machiavelli's The Prince, which helped me to develop the interesting question underlying my stories, is history personal or statistical? I take from this passage two things. The first of which is that Pynchon loved stories of plotting princes conspiring against their enemies and plebeian assassins and revolutionaries conspiring against their elites. On the other hand, though, there is the question of the distinction between the personal and the statistical. And this begs the most basic question asked by the civil rights and New Left generation. Can we become free? Or do we live in a society structured in dominance? If history is statistical, and we all fall into rank, file, and category, how does it appear to those of us who are subject to its cold determination? Is it a grand historical telos, a conspiracy of the power elite, the reign of power and knowledge, discourse and information? Or is it all fixed by God and fixed in the stars? The theme is central not just to Pynchon's writing, but to the counterculture more broadly. It is the bedrock of paranoia that shapes the politics of a generation. Now, Pynchon then, and these are again more Dennis Stock, this is, you will recognize the Art and Architecture building here at the UC Berkeley campus. Now, it should be said that, right, of course, paranoia is one of the great themes of Pynchon's work. I love the drug ads, the Thorazine. Again, why does Thorazine need to add? When patients lash out at them, right? Thorazine. Now, the era of conspiracy theory, of course, begins with the Kennedy assassination, but I actually want to argue in particular that it begins the day before, the day that American historian Richard Hofstadter, on November 21st, 1963, at a lecture in Oxford University, gave his famous talk called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. This essay, not unlike the next day's murder in Dallas, set off a substantive debate among many of America's most prominent and widely read historians, the terms of which continue to preoccupy us to this day. For Hofstadter, the paranoid style evidenced a style of mind evoking the qualities of heated exaggeration, this is a quote, heated exaggeration, suspiciousness, and conspiratorial fantasy. This style claimed knowledge of a totalizing variety, believing in, quote, a vast or gigantic conspiracy as the motive force in historical events. History is a conspiracy set in motion by demonic forces of almost transcendental power, writes Hofstadter. Now, of course, Hofstadter thinks that people who believe this are pathological. They are paranoid, which he's using quite literally in the pejorative psychopathologizing term, right? That this was a pathology of uncompromising and extremist minds, and that it was the price that we as Americans paid for the consensus-driven suburban flatness that Oedipa eventually comes to question, right? So if they're crazy people on the margins foisting conspiracy theories, that's okay because we're safe in the center here. And the price we pay for liberal democracy is putting up with crazy people on the margins. That is until crazy people on the margins take over the center, which is what happened on November 8th of this year. You remember that? Or last night, or the last 42 days, right? Anyhow, but there is, I want to argue, another theory of paranoia, a better one, that is far more dialectical and, dare I say, Pynchonian, that emerges from this time and space as well. It is by regression to magic under late capitalism, writes the German exiled philosopher Theodor Adorno in Minima Moralia. Thought is assimilated to late capitalist forms. The bent little fortune tellers terrorizing their clients with crystal balls are toy models of the great ones who hold the fate of mankind in their hand. Just as hostile and conspiratorial as the obscurantance of psychic research is society itself. For Adorno, then, paranoia was a belief in conspiracies that comes from a partial experience of the social totality, which is both too rationally complex and too centrally controlled for ordinary people to place themselves within. And this dialectic between the hyper-rational and authoritarian society on the one hand and the increasingly insignificant lives of most individuals on the other becomes the breeding ground of paranoid social movements and paranoid psychological spaces. By the 1950s, Adorno began to find evidence of paranoid projection everywhere he looked, And in the long study of the Los Angeles Times astrology column entitled The Stars Down to Earth, he located in this seemingly innocuous corner of the culture industry, quote, a broader area of psychological determinants and social attitudes. For Adorno, astrology was inextricably bound up within the totally administered and probably fascistic society. Driven by a, quote, enthusiastic obedience to the rhythm of the iron system that he and his fellow German exiles found both in the Third Reich and among the suburban wilds of Southern California. Today's world, concluded Adorno, which offers such a strong reality basis for everyone's sense of being persecuted, calls for paranoiac characters. Now, this is a brilliant theory, one has to admit, but one that could only have been written by someone terrified equally by Leni Riefenstahl and Walt Disney. And it marks the work of a Marxist intellectual living in the atomic age Los Angeles, surrounded by highways, HUAC, and snooping FBI agents. How could you blame him for feeling a little bit paranoid? Now, Herbert Marcuse, perhaps more famous than Adorno's writings in this sense, gives us the same kind of contradiction when he says, does not the threat of an atomic catastrophe which could wipe out the human race also serve to protect the very forces which perpetuate this danger? We submit to the peaceful production of the means of destruction, to the perfection of waste, of being educated for a defense which deforms the defenders and that which they defend. This, then, is precisely the world that fascinated and repelled Thomas Pynchon. Now, his first novel proved to be a major success, a novel of surprising breadth, erudition, and inventiveness, particularly for a first novel. When V was nominated for a National Book Award and eventually won a Faulkner First Novel Prize, he gained a certain measure of press attention, and when a reporter from Time magazine was dispatched to interview him at a forwarding address in Mexico City, Thomas simply fled, toting his multiple manuscripts, all written on graph paper, in what turned into a decades-long chase scene. He has never been officially photographed or interviewed in the whole of his adult life. Not that the old man doesn't have a sense of humor about it, however.
Here's your quote. Thomas Pynchon loved this book almost as much as he loves cameras. Hey, over here, have your picture taken with a reclusive author. Today only, we'll throw in a free autograph. But wait, there's more.
This is in 2004. Pynchon has done 2 Simpsons episodes, always wearing a bag over his head. In a rare letter published from 1978, Pynchon told a friend, quote, "As for spilling my life story, I try to do that all the time. Nobody ever wants to listen for some strange reason." It's clear that Pynchon's novels are all autobiographical. He writes his friends into his stories all the time, right? He just has never written an autobiography. This is my fantasy, is that he is hard at work on an 800-page autobiography called Mindless Pleasures. That's my hope for. Okay. Anyways, if you're out there, can you get to work on that? All right. Thank you. The marriage of his best friend Richard Farina to Mimi Baez, the sister of folk singer Joan Baez, drew Thomas Pynchon out of hiding and into a prolonged period of rootless residence in California, ranging from beach towns in LA to backyard cottages in Berkeley, and eventually hiding in wooded cabins in Humboldt County and Eureka. Farina's death in 1966, on the very day that his book was published, drew Pynchon back out again, only for us to learn that he was not staying put long enough to be detected. Pynchon's life in the 1960s California was not one of isolation, however. In fact, he seems to always have a girlfriend and a countercultural community within the picture. Instead, he lived a life of cultivated anonymity, his privacy and his strange work habits protected by his friends. In 1964, in an apparent fit of self-doubt about his future as a writer, Pynchon applied to the PhD program in mathematics here at UC Berkeley. Thankfully, the math department rejected him, a failure that perhaps finds representation in Oedipa Moss's walk across Sproul Plaza in Chapter 4, and perhaps propelled him to sell The Crying of Lot 49 as a means of financing his monk-like existence, pot-smoking monk-like existence, as he worked on 3 or 4 novels simultaneously. In fact, one of his friends commented that he explained the plot line of Mason and Dixon, published in 1997, as early as 1970. The one thing that Pynchon published before Gravity's Rainbow, though, deserves to be noted, which is this remarkable article published in the New York Times Magazine called A Journey into the Mind of Watts, published June 12, 1966, in which he describes driving into the city of Watts to interrogate what he called the heart of Los Angeles's racial sickness. He writes, quote, "The two cultures do not understand each other," white and black, that is. "The white values are displayed without let-up on black people's TV screens and through the panoramic scenes of black impoverishment it is hard to miss from atop the Harbor Freeway, which so many whites must drive at least twice every working day. Somehow it occurs to few of them to leave the Imperial Highway for a change, to go east instead of west, only a few blocks, and take a look at Watts. A quick look, the simplest kind of beginning, but Watts is country which lies psychologically uncounted miles further than most whites seem at present willing to travel. Watts lies impacted in the heart of this white fantasy. It is, by contrast, he continues, a pocket of bitter reality. The only illusion Watts ever allowed itself was to believe for a long time in the white version of what a Negro was supposed to be. But with the Muslim and civil rights movement, that went too. Now, with Baldwin-esque or Baldwin-ish moral precision, Pynchon diagnoses the racial problem in the United States as a crisis of whiteness and the morality of white people, who impose their racial imaginations onto black folks, condemn them when they don't conform to these reductive identities, and then ignore them when their everyday miseries do indeed achieve their goals for them. Journey into the Mind of Watts could be Pynchon's introduction to Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, sort of like Sartre wrote an introduction to Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, in which the white author explains to other white people why they should read this black author. Now, like Sartre, Pynchon would, of course, say people of color need not read this. Skip right ahead to the Baldwin, to the Fanon. This one is to help explain why white people need to take up this moral crisis. Now, of course, in the atomic age, right, now, what Pynchon, I should say, reveals is that black folks understand the white world far better than white people understand the black world, because it is their survival is dependent on it, right? African American survival is dependent on being able to navigate the white world. But of course, in the atomic age, everyone's survival depends on understanding the connections that Pynchon lays out between technology, war, and white supremacy here concentrated in California. Pynchon's time at Boeing, no less than his time in Berkeley, Watts, or Eureka, seems to loom large in his biography through the characterization of Yo-Yo-Dine in The Crying of Lot 49, and in his image of the rocket, the central image or myth or metaphor of Gravity's Rainbow. A name every bit as obviously symbolic as Oedipa Moss, the story of Yo-Yo-Dine leads us to Rocketdyne, spun off from North American Aviation in 1955 and based in Canoga Park, California. Rocketdyne Aerospace Incorporated got the first government contract to collect, ship, and study the German A-4 rocket bomb, better known to us as the V-2. The primary contractor for rocket engine design to a team led by Dr. Werner von Braun, based in the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. Rocketdyne then forms an essential narrative component for what will become Gravity's Rainbow, and that is their Dr. Werner von Braun in the late 60s standing at the foot of the Saturn V rocket engines built by Rocketdyne. Now, von Braun, in my estimation, is the whitest man who ever lived. Born an aristocratic Prussian, dreamed of being the first man to land on another planet, who then, took up with the Nazis when they became enthusiastic visionaries of the rocket, allowing von Braun and Walter Dornberg and a number of others to engage in the research project that will eventually lead to the construction of the first human object to fly into space. Now, of course, we know what happened to the Nazis. Things did not go well for them, but not for the U.S. lack of trying, because as the United States invaded Europe in 1944, the early branch of the CIA, known as the OSS, landed in Normandy with instructions to find Dr. von Braun and Walter Dornan and others in an attempt to recruit them and to bring them back to the United States in a historical episode known as Operation Paperclip. Now, Operation Paperclip was an attempt, to kidnap, to steal, to lure, to seduce Nazi scientists to come to the United States to help build our projects, right? And Wernher von Braun here was the leader of the troop of 104 German rocket scientists who gathered here for a photograph near their barracks at the Army Ordnance Base in Fort Bliss near El Paso, Texas in 1946. Of Wernher von Braun's original Paperclip team seen here, 90 of whom were under the age of 30, 14 held PhDs, more than half were members of the Nazi Party, 21 were members of the Stormtroopers, 2, including Wernher von Braun, were members of the SS. Now, Wernher von Braun, it should be said, is without question a war criminal. This was a man who, right, is responsible for organizing the construction facility, the Dora Mittelwerk plant in northern Germany, the caves, the tunnels in which the V-2 rockets were built. Now, the V-2 has the unique distinction in military-industrial history of being the only weapon in world history that killed more people to make than it did as a weapon of war. Some 40 to 50,000 people died in those tunnels, slaves, building V-2 rockets, whereas the rocket itself, in dropping on Antwerp, London, and elsewhere, killed probably in excess of 8,000 or 9,000 people. So this is the horror that von Braun supervised and took part in. But yet the American state is all too ready to welcome these Nazi scientists and give them whatever they need if it will give us an advantage over the Soviets in the next war. And so we see here an article from the New York Times that says, "New Peenemünde rises on the Rio Grande banks," Peenemünde being the research station on the Baltic where von Braun first built the V-2. Now, von Braun then, always desirous to get into space, to get the United States to the moon, having been in the United States long enough, then began a kind of public relations campaign, which worked through Collier's magazine, and then eventually was picked up by Walt Disney. On one of his many trips to the West Coast to confer with various aerospace contractors like Rocketdyne and Aerojet, von Braun then began spending a great deal of time with Disney producer Ward Kimball and with the Imagineers at Disney. Together, they imagined Tomorrowland, produced through 3 science-factual movies about the potential for space travel. The films worked so well because they consciously combined the language of Frontierland, the white male explorer tropes of Adventureland, and the bright colors and magic sparkle of Fantasyland to produce a rocket-centric vision of Tomorrowland. Did you know that a Nazi designed Tomorrowland, one of the 4 spaces in the original Disney that opened in 1955? These are stills from Man in Space, right, which reached some 42 million people in 1955 and an absolutely enormous audience. So I know you've never asked this question, but I'm going to pose it anyways. How do you turn a Nazi war criminal into an American hero? The short answer is that you turn his vision into a Walt Disney theme park. And you think Pynchon is wild and exuberant. Reality is worse. Now, it is Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow from 1973 that marks the counterculture's most profound confrontation with domination and freedom. And it begins with the rocket falling overhead. A screaming comes across the sky. It has happened before, but there is nothing to compare to it now. We begin in media res, right? The rocket falling on our heads. Where will it land? Will it land on us, right? We've heard this before. It has happened before. More rockets have fallen, but there's nothing to compare to it now. Now, in abstract, left in space, this could be anywhere. This could be a rocket falling on us right here, right now. The story as it proceeds, right, we learn that we're in London. There's an evacuation in process, right? And it is, in fact, then the winter of 1944, and V-2 rockets are falling on London in a pattern British intelligence officers soon discover marks precisely onto the sexual conquests of the American Lieutenant Tyrone Slothrop. Conditioned since infancy by Pavlovians and German chemists alike, Slothrop's erections appear to predict the V-2 trajectories in a feat of reverse causality. How? In many ways, like just exactly how the explosion of the V-2 rocket precedes the screaming sound. These are the first objects to travel faster than the speed of sound, right? You are blown up by the rocket, and then everyone hears the sound. If you hear it coming, it missed you, right? Works that way with bullets, too, right? The uncanny psychosexual connection of the rocket thus sets off a wild chase across post-war Europe, the zone in which Slothrop, along with a cast of hundreds of displaced characters, seeks out the meaning of the rocket 00000. Taking place in the 9 months spanning the end of World War II in Europe from December 1944 to August 1945, the novel covers the geography of the rocket's impacts and inventions between London, the Dora Mittelwerk, and the Nazi-designed installations of Peenemünde before ending via a cinematic jump cut to the instant before our own collective annihilation in a Los Angeles movie theater. No brief description can do justice to the terrifying variety of dark satire, silly songs, funny names, wild sexual acts, rocket limericks. There once was a thing called a V2, to pilot which you did not need to. You just pushed a button and it wouldn't leave nothing but stiffs and big holes and debris to. There's about 8 of those, that's the best one. Drug hallucinations, corporate seances, tarot card reading, cybernetics, thermodynamics, mathematics, and an encyclopedic array of literary and historical references that make this perhaps the most purchased and abandoned novel in American literary history. Half of you probably own a copy, and half of you all probably quit at exactly the same place I quit the first time I read it, in a thoroughly disgusting scene that describes erotic cropophagia. Look that one up, I'm not explaining it. Anyways, the V2 rocket, with the rocket, Pynchon describes a meta-symbol of Western history and the technology at its peak of destructiveness. The most expansive effort, then, to trace out a dizzying array of technologies of conspiracy and control. The man has a branch office in each of our brains, writes Pynchon. His corporate emblem is a white albatross. His local rep has a cover known as the ego, and their mission in this world is bad shit. In addition to placing the V2, like Melville's White Whale, at the novel's thematic core, Pynchon makes use of the figure of Wernher von Braun, right? And the novel's opening pages offers an epigraph from von Braun, imagining the transcendent of the human soul through technology. Through this theme of transformation, as well as questionable spiritual practices, sets off, right, the history of the text itself. Now, von Braun is in many respects transposed onto multiple characters in this, including Major Weissmann, the SS man in charge of the rocket, also known as Dominus Blissero, a figure of sadomasochistic evil whose names quite literally mean white man and Lord Death. An original practitioner of racial embodiment of the novel, an original practitioner of racial genocide against the Hereros in German Sudwest Africa, Weissmann is the embodiment of the novel's paranoid them, or they, a torturing and manipulative colonial officer turned leader of the rocket state cartel. Yet Pynchon seems to have Wernher von Braun in mind when he describes Weissmann at Peenemünde as, quote, all things to all men, a brand new military type, part salesman, part scientist. And at the novel's end, then, Weissmann launches the last V2, the mysterious rocket 00000, with its abused but adoring sacrificial object, the Aryan specimen little boy Gottfried, stuffed into the chamber in the nose cone. This rocket satirically blasting an Aryan boy into space as a symbol of Nazi conquest and transcendence, which immediately transforms via cinematic jump cut into the nuclear missile falling on the novel's last page. And it is just here, just at this dark and silent frame, that the pointed tip of the rocket, falling nearly a mile per second, absolutely and forever without sound, reaches its last immeasurable gap above the room of the old theater, the last Delta T. There is still time, if you need the comfort, to touch the person next to you, to reach between your own cold legs, or if song must find you, here's one they never taught anyone to sing, a hymn by William Slothrop, centuries forgotten and out of print, sung to the simple and pleasant air of the period, Follow the Bouncing Ball. There is a hand to turn the time, though thy glass today be run, till the light that hath brought the towers low find the last poor preterite one, till the riders sleep by every road, all through our crippled zone, with a face on every mountainside and a soul in every stone. Now everybody. This remarkable moment establishes the novel's narrative as purely circular. It starts with the launching and descent of a rocket. It ends with the launch and the descent of a rocket. And that circularity is historical. It starts with the launch of the first ICBM, and it ends with the launch of the last ICBM. The rocket, the good rocket to take us to the stars, the bad rocket, the end of all life on Earth. That dialectic, that exchange, is what drives this novel and makes it all quite so deeply uncomfortable, so frightening, so dark, and why, quite frankly, I gave away the ending and can't recommend anybody read this. I want you to read it, but I need you to find your own way to it. It is big, shall we say? It's big. Now, just as I need to bring this to an end here, and the way to do that is to recognize that Gravity's Rainbow won a National Book Award. It was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize unanimously, but the Pulitzer Committee, the larger Pulitzer Committee, tried to read it, declared it obscene and unreadable, and so no novel received a Pulitzer Prize in fiction in 1973. Now, when he won the National Book Award, Pynchon sent a stand-up comedian to receive the award who stood up there, pretended to be Pynchon, and issued a stream of malapropisms. Pynchon then disappears for 13 years, wandering. Very few people actually know where he was during this time, although it's broadly understood that he was smoking weed on a Northern California pot farm. Because what comes next, eventually, in 1990, is the ultimate novel of reckoning with what the 1960s actually meant, namely Vineland. Now, some people don't like this. I find Vineland to be beautiful. It's quite straightforward, it's hilarious, it's beautifully written, and it is deeply political. It actually explains what happened to the 1960s. How did the 60s end? Vineland tells us. And I want to read this brief passage here because Zoid Wheeler, our main character here, this is entirely set in the northern latitudes of California with flashbacks to the 1960s. And Zoid Wheeler here meets up with his old friend Mucho Moss, who shows up again, having newly been divorced from Oedipa, apparently very amicably. But Mucho blinked sympathetically, a little sadly. I guess it's over. We're on to a new world now. It's the Nixon years. It'll be the Reagan years. Old Reagan? No way he'll ever make president. Just go careful, Zoid, because soon they're going to be coming after everything. Not just drugs, but beer, cigarettes, sugar, fat, salt, you name it. Anything that could remotely please any of your senses, because they need to control all that, and they will. Fat police? Perfume police? Tube police? Music police? Good, healthy shit police? Get to renounce everything now. Best to renounce everything now. Get a head start. I still with it back then. When you were the Count, remember how the acid was? Remember the window pane down in Laguna that time? God, I knew then. I knew. Yeah, but they can't take what happened. What we found out. Easy. They just let us forget. Give us too much to process. Fill up every minute. Keep us distracted. It's what the tube is for. And though it kills me to say it, it's what rock and roll is becoming. Just another way to claim our attention. So that beautiful certainty we had starts to fade. And after a while, they have us convinced all over again that we really are going to die and that they've got it again. It was the way people used to talk. I'm not going to forget, Zoid vowed. Fuck them. While we had it, we really had some fun. And they never let us forget it. Mucho went to the stereo and put on the best of Sam Cooke, volumes 1 and 2. And then they sat together and listened, both of them this time, to the sermons, one they knew and felt in their hearts comforted by. Though outside spread the lampless wastes, the unseen paybacks, the heartless power of the scabbard garrison state, the green free America of their childhood even then was turning into. This is how the 60s end. And so as to bring myself to an end, I will just perhaps leave it there and offer you the sense that Pynchon's California is the one that is perhaps most effectively mapped by Rebecca Solnit in this map. He may be a countercultural figure. This is called the right wing of the Dove, and it maps the various military, industrial, and right-wing think tanks installations spread across the Bay Area. Pynchon is a countercultural figure, to be sure, but the countercultural figure whose eye was always poised towards the technology, the power, the authority that was looking to suppress, to contain, and ultimately to destroy us. And in the end, it's my argument is that essentially Pynchon's wild language, wild structure, bizarre narrative forms is actually the only form of literary realism capable of capturing this moment and our own moment down to the present day. And with that, I should have stopped 10 minutes ago. Thank you. Questions? That's what I suspected. All right.
So, Michael, I'm having a hallucination now. I don't need drugs for that. That's from Pynchon. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned Thomas Pynchon in relation to other postmodernist authors. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on who you consider his contemporaries.
Well, there's lots. I mean, I think in this course, for those of you who are interested, that I assigned 3 novels, and though I don't know that Pynchon would necessarily recognize them as immediate peers, they're the people that I kind of put him in the category with, which would be Ishmael Reed, in particular, and Ursula Le Guin, but other people like Philip K. Dick, and then John Barth, and a number of other kind of major figures of this, the postmodernist writers of the time. But I think it's particularly interesting that in Gravity's Rainbow, there's a kind of beautiful moment where Pynchon actually says, you know, he's writing about the Masons and these competing racial secret societies, and he just stops and says, oh, you know, really? You should check out Ishmael Reed. He knows way more about this than I ever will. It's just this parentheses where the voice from 1973 is just like, stop, oh, by the way, read Ishmael Reed, right? So in that sense, I mean, I see those as his contemporaries. But what's interesting is that Pynchon scrupulously avoids a kind of wider literary landscape, right? He doesn't want to hang out with writers. He wants to hang out with ordinary people. He wants to hang out with people on pot farms in Northern California. He wants to ride Greyhound buses and listen to the way people talk. He wants to escape, to flee, to hide, or to, as he is now, lives on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, writing books, in particular, A Bleeding Edge there in the end now about New York City. He's sort of become all that which he may have perhaps once hated. But he's not a figure that actually identifies broadly with other writers. He's a figure that identifies broadly with the preterite masses, those of us passed over, left behind, left to suffer through a world that exceeds our grasp. Does anybody know Thomas Pynchon? Anybody met him? No? All right, too bad.
Ishmael Reed is going to be coming to speak here.
Yeah.
Just an FYI.
Yeah.
Could you just speak to why you think Ursula Le Guin is a contemporary?
Well, in part just because part of what Pynchon and Le Guin and Reed and Samuel Delany and a number of these other writers are doing, Octavia Butler and the like, are taking lowbrow genres and investing them with things that have never actually, with sophisticated literary merit. Science fiction, anthropology, secret society stories, conspiracy narratives, crime and detective stories, and rendering them as a form of postmodern high art. So the notion that science fiction, in the 1950s, science fiction was schlock, kitsch, paperback, garbage, the kind of stuff that, Philip Dick writes over and over and over again, but that it took the 1970s and 1980s for people to pick up these decaying paperbacks and be like, that's genius. This guy's the best writer of our time, or one of. And Ursula Le Guin's doing the same thing. I mean, she's pushing the bounds of science fiction in the 70s in a time in which science fiction was still seen as a lowbrow genre. Now, Pynchon is doing similar things. I mean, limericks, really? There's like a dozen pornographic limericks in this. Okay, really? Limericks? I mean, the goofy song that I just sang. I mean, that's absurd. And let me just say this. Ulysses is the least funny book anyone has ever read. Okay? There's not even a single fucking joke, and it's 800 pages. It's just god-awful, right? I mean, it's brilliant and all of that stuff, but it's just so unfunny. Whereas, the idea that you're going to write an 800-page postmodern masterpiece that is a scream, that is hilarious, that has puns and slapstick jokes on every page, that's innovative. That's something only Pynchon's really been able to do. Yeah.
I've read a decent amount of Pynchon, but obviously you've read a lot
he's okay. He's a happy guy. I do worry about him, and this is why I kind of hope that his autobiography is forthcoming, which it's not, I assure you. But I don't know. That's a good question. I think, like, what I would suggest on the one hand is this Slow Learner was published in 1984. It's a collection of his sort of early short stories. But what's really beautiful about Slow Learner is it's got this really fun introduction that he wrote, where he describes, how bad all of his early stories are. It's kind of this autobiographical text. And you really do get a sense that the guy's capable of self-deprecation, that he's quite funny, that that he's happy with who he is and where he's at. So that the one time where his voice speaks as his voice is in the introduction to Slow Learner. Whoop. I'm just going to start breaking things up here. The other is, what I would say is Inherent Vice. I think Inherent Vice is really is the most sort of straightforward of his texts. It's a kind of clear detective story in which, the detective is kind of melancholic, sort of sour, but at the same time, happy. He muddles through, right? He's one of us. So in that sense, but then, there's all of it. In a sense, I do get the sense that he is happy. But I don't know, that he believes in the power of resistance. He believes in the counterforce, or the secret society connected by the Trastero, that this is some kind of possibility of an underground that all of us can be a part of, that we can find freedom through escape, through fleeing, through running, through nomadism, through all the things that Greg Castillo talked about last week. But that also that in the end, I think what I have been led to believe by other places is that at this point, he's actually really quite happy. He married a young woman who's his literary agent. They have a son. They live in the Upper West Side. He's far more productive now, and he seems to be quite happy by all accounts. You could ask Michael Chabon. Apparently he had lunch with him a couple months ago. If you can find Michael Chabon, I hear he lives in this town.
Do we know any thought of the adaptation of Inherent Vice?
He gave his full approval to it and liked it very much, is what you hear. But the problem with that is, maybe this is a place to end, is that we were promised a Pynchon cameo in Inherent Vice, and it's not there. Because the one person that people pegged to figure, that's the guy, that's got to be Thomas Pynchon, is actually turns out to be a well-known sort of background dude out of Central Casting. So the entire internet was like, I found him, that's him! And then, 20 seconds later, Twitter's like, nah, it's this dude. So maybe the director's cut, Pynchon will show up in some random spot, but apparently he's not in there. To me, he's on The Simpsons. Right? How could you be not? Yeah, literally, when he was presented with the script, he wrote a couple of extra puns for them about the frying of Latke 49 and the Gravity's Rainbow Cookbook. That's V-licious, right? But that he also told the producers of The Simpsons that he would refuse to slur the name of Homer, who he considered a personal hero. I think that's the kind of guy he is. But what do we know? Yeah. It's Pynchon, but I've been saying Pynchon my whole life, and I kept trying to say Pynchon, and then I would lose track of what I was saying. So yes, it's the hard on, Pynchon. Now I did it wrong the entire time, but I'm correcting it at the end. All right, thanks everybody.